This is Hypatia. She was one of the greatest minds of her generation, living in the Egyptian city of Alexandria. And one day, in the year 415, while she was on her way home, a violent crowd suddenly ambushed her, dragged her from her carriage into a nearby church, and killed her. And the people who killed her were all Christian.
Oh no, what's happening? That doesn't sound very Christian.
Yeah, it was terrible. This is known as the Murder of Hypatia, and it happened right in the middle of a particularly complicated and uncomfortable century for Christian history, between roughly 325 and 451 AD.
Right. For the first 300 years, Christians were tested by persecution and suffering, but this century was the first time Christians were tested by power and influence, when Christians went from being a persecuted minority to becoming one of the most powerful forces in the Roman Empire.
This is the story of how Christians navigated that new world, how theological debates spilled out into the streets, and how, at the end of it, the church experienced its first permanent split.
By the 330s, the Roman Empire was being ruled by a Christian for the first time, the Emperor Constantine, and he wasn't shy about it. He was funding churches, promoting Christians to government positions, and starting to put Christian faith at the center of imperial life. For Christians everywhere, this was a huge shock. Only a couple of decades ago, Christians were being killed in the arenas, their leaders were being arrested, and their house churches were destroyed by the Roman emperors. But all of a sudden, the emperor himself was on their side. And after Constantine died, his sons, who were also Christians, went even further. They began to ban worshipping the old gods. Blood sacrifices were outlawed and temples were slowly shut down. The ancient traditions were beginning to fade away. For Christians, this was fantastic. It was the dawning of a new age. The old gods were cruel and evil, so it was good that people weren't worshipping them anymore. The world was freed from their power. But for many Roman non-Christians, the polytheists, their world was being turned upside down. The old gods, who were supposed to protect Rome, were being swept away, and by the Roman emperors themselves. And so tensions began to rise through the decades. And then, in the year 379, the Emperor Theodosius took over. He was really serious about Christianity, and he was actually the one who made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire.
Wait, really? I thought Constantine did that.
No, but lots of people think that. It was actually Theodosius who made it the empire's faith. This didn't mean everyone had to become Christian. Theodosius still let everyone believe and pray to whichever god they wanted. But it did symbolize that there was no going back to the old world. 10 years later came one of the most dramatic moments of the century. In the city of Alexandria, Theodosius had ordered a neglected temple to be turned into a church. And as the bishop was clearing out the temple, he publicly paraded the temple objects through the streets. This seriously offended Alexandria's polytheists, and rioting broke out. They started attacking and killing Christians, and Christians fought back. The polytheists fell back and barricaded themselves inside the most beautiful and important temple in the city, the Serapeum. This was a temple to the god Serapis, who controlled the waters of the Nile. When the people inside refused to come out, Theodosius ordered for the temple to be completely destroyed and for a church to be built where it used to be.
And it was about 20 years later in that same city that Hypatia was killed. Here's what happened. Around this time, there was a bishop called Cyril in Alexandria. Remember him, he's going to be important later. Cyril had recently fallen out with the governor of the city, who was also a Christian. Now, Hypatia was a non-Christian philosopher, but was also a close advisor to the governor, and a rumor had begun circulating that she was using that influence to turn the governor against Cyril. And so a plot was hatched to murder her.
Oh man, that's really bad. What are we meant to make of it?
Well, and this is important, the only reason we know about Hypatia at all is because a Christian historian named Socrates wrote about it at the time and called it what it was. Terrible, completely un-Christian, something that should be unthinkable to Christians. Many Christians condemned violence like this, but it did still happen occasionally, especially in Alexandria. And it happened because power does things to people and to institutions.
Lots of theologians at the time were openly wrestling with this problem. How do you follow Jesus when Jesus' followers run the world? And things weren't always simple with the Christian emperor. He regularly clashed with Christians on the ground. Some Christian leaders, like Ambrose, even confronted the emperor, saying that he was not above the church and shouldn't get too involved in church matters. Lots of Christians were becoming monks, retreating from society into the deserts to try and keep the purity of the faith alive. And around this time, a theologian called Augustine was writing an incredible book called The City of God, making it really clear that even though the church and the empire existed in the same space, they were completely different entities. And Christians should never get that confused. No matter how important they might be in society, Christians should always think of themselves as ultimately belonging to God and his heavenly city. Christians make a huge mistake when they let the rules of the earthly city, a desire for power or wealth, bleed into the city of God. But that's a lot easier said than done, and these are questions that we're still wrestling with today.
But here's the thing. As tricky as this conflict between the Christians and the non-Christians was, it was nothing compared to the fights Christians were having with each other. Fights which led to the first permanent split in the church.
No, what happened?
Well, remember the Council of Nicaea?
Yeah, the one that solved all the debates and created the Nicene Creed.
Yeah, that one. Well, things didn't settle down afterwards. In fact, debates continued to rage. And here's the weird thing, it wasn't just bishops and theologians arguing about it. It was spilling into everyday life. Ordinary people were interested in these arguments too. Shopkeepers and soldiers and their wives and mothers were all debating tiny details of the wording about the nature of Jesus Christ. These debates went on in marketplaces, in bathhouses, everywhere really.
This kind of sounds exhausting. Why do people care so much?
Well, imagine this. Christianity was still brand new. It had only been 300 years since God had come into this world in Jesus. And when that happened, heaven and earth had actually genuinely met. The world had been saved, God was with us, everything had changed forever. And that depended on Jesus being truly and fully God and truly and fully human. But the problem was, people disagreed about which side was most in danger of being lost in the way Christians talked about Jesus. For some people, the most important thing to make sure they got right was protecting Jesus' godness. If you lose that, you just get a very impressive human who said some beautiful things, but not God himself entering into the world. God was not with us. But for others, it was about protecting Jesus' humanness. If you lose that, you end up with a divine being who only pretended to suffer with us. It would mean Jesus' tears, his pain, and his cross weren't real. God was not with us.
Oh, wow, yeah, that is really important.
Which is why people got so passionate about it. One bishop described the atmosphere of this era as like two great fleets of warships racing towards one another. As the ships clash and the storm clouds descend, no one can tell friend from foe anymore in the chaos. That's what it felt like.
Okay, so what happened?
Throughout the 300s, there were lots of smaller councils, all trying to resolve the different conflicts. None of them worked, and so the Emperor Theodosius convened a council in his capital city in 381, the Council of Constantinople. This council clarified Nicaea and produced something you might actually recognize, the creed that most Christians still say today.
Well, that's good.
But then, a few years later, a new controversy erupted, and at the center of it was this guy, Cyril of Alexandria. Remember him? And the Bishop of Constantinople called Nestorius.
Is this going to be more controversy around words?
Sort of. There was an argument between Nestorius and Cyril about Mary, the mother of Jesus. Nestorius had a concern about a title that was being used for Mary in popular prayers, Theotokos, which means God-bearer, mother of God. Even though Nestorius absolutely believed that Jesus was God, he was less sure about saying that Mary, a human woman, could give birth to God. He may have worried that this blurred the line between Jesus' humanness and godness to the point that Jesus stops being genuinely human. And so Nestorius said that he preferred the title Christotokos, Mother of Christ, a title that he felt was safer.
And let me guess, Cyril was outraged.
Of course. For Cyril, this made Jesus too divided. Nestorius was separating Jesus' humanness and godness too much. If Jesus is fully God and fully human, there is nothing wrong with calling Mary the Mother of God. And so he mobilized bishops across the empire, and the controversy grew so heated that the emperor summoned yet another council in 431 in Ephesus. The atmosphere was electric. Cyril had apparently whipped up a crowd to chant Theotokos all night long. And the council didn't really go as planned either. Before everyone had even arrived, Cyril opened the council and quickly had Nestorius condemned. And so when another bishop from Antioch, called John, arrived, he was furious that the council had already happened, and he opened a counter-council to get Cyril deposed.
Oh man, this is so messy.
Yeah, it got really chaotic. But eventually the dust did settle because Nestorius renounced his position for the sake of maintaining church unity. But in the end, the emperor had him exiled down the Nile anyway.
Oh.
But there's still one final chapter of this story.
Oh yeah, the split.
Soon after this, there was another issue because of a monk called Eutyches. He was so committed to defending Jesus' godness that he swung too far the other way, arguing that Jesus' humanness was completely absorbed into his godness.
Wait, I think I can work out why this was bad. If Jesus' humanness was just absorbed into his godness, into one thing, then actually his humanness just stops existing?
Exactly. And of course, this called for yet another council. In the year 451, in the city of Chalcedon, just across the water from Constantinople, over 500 bishops came together to discuss the issue. Together, they produced something called the Chalcedonian definition. And it's worth sitting with it for a second. Jesus Christ, one person, two natures, fully divine, fully human, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. That first part was just to confirm what everybody believed from Nicaea, that Jesus was fully God and fully human. But then those four phrases were really carefully chosen. Without confusion and change was meant to rule out Eutyches. Jesus was fully God and fully human, and you had to hold that tension. He was not something in the middle or some new third category. Without division and without separation was meant to rule out what Nestorius was accused of. Jesus was fully God and fully human in one person, completely together. It was trying to hold all the tensions at once, the tension of heaven meets earth, of God and humanity. And this is the moment where everything should have come together.
But unfortunately, it wasn't. For lots of bishops in the Eastern churches, especially from Alexandria, they thought that the whole discussion agreed too much with Nestorius, and that the final wording didn't go far enough. They felt that it still made Jesus look too divided, and that it betrayed the legacy of what Cyril had spent his life fighting for. During the council, many of these bishops walked out, and they didn't come back. The communities they represented became what we today call the Oriental Orthodox churches, like the Coptic Church in Egypt, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and the Syriac Orthodox Church. And this was the first permanent split of Christian history.
That was a lot. I mean, what do we make of all this? This seems really, really far away from Jesus and the disciples. It kind of does feel like everything's been derailed.
Yeah, it's easy to look at this century and just see the ugly stuff. The power plays, the exiles, the mobs, the murder of Hypatia, the destruction of the Serapeum, chaotic councils, a church that couldn't keep itself together. But it's important to remember that all this was just half of the story. Outside the Roman Empire, in the Persian Empire and beyond, there were just as many Christians whose lives carried on without the complicated problems that came with being in power. They were still worshipping in house churches and being persecuted. Also, a lot of progress has been made, especially in the last 100 years, healing this split. There have been several really good discussions between Christian leaders on both sides, which have helped clarify the debate, leading to a good relationship.
But all those things did happen, and we shouldn't just ignore them. But here's how we can think about it. Ultimately, these debates and councils weren't just about politics or philosophy or trying to define God. What they were really about was trying to help Christians everywhere fully grasp the beauty of Jesus, who is God with us. They were finding the words that Christians would use in their church services every single week.
Underneath all of it, It was about people who deeply loved and cared about Jesus and wanted to follow him faithfully. In fact, something shifted during this period. For the first 3 centuries, Christians almost never depicted Jesus on the cross. It was still shameful and too ugly. You didn't put that kind of thing on your wall.
But all these debates were part of a wider shift. It was during this time that people started to think deeply about what it actually meant for Jesus to be human, and for them to think about what it meant for Jesus to actually suffer. No one could look away from the cross anymore. This was also the century when the first Christian depictions of Jesus on the cross began to appear, and the practice of meditating on the crucifixion became more widespread.
This was a God who was with us. But not just that, this was a God who suffers with us, like us and for us. So all those paintings and statues and sculptures that we see today of Jesus on the cross go back to this period in time. And that's really beautiful.
And while all this was happening in the big cities of the Roman Empire, there was another movement taking place. Deep in the deserts of Egypt, men and women were fighting demons. These were the Desert Fathers and Mothers. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Christian Story. Christian Story is a crowd-funded project where everything we make is made possible with the generous support of viewers like you. So if you enjoyed this video and want to see more, you can start giving on our website today. And don't forget to like and subscribe. It would really help us out.